You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. Brewing tensions in the Middle East. What could stop the escalation? We'll ask our panelists right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight live on CGTN with me, Tian Wei. Tensions between Iran and the U.S. take a turn for the worse as leaders of the two countries show no signs of compromising over the Iran nuclear deal. Since President Trump ripped it apart last year, signatories to the accord have been urging the White House to respect the deal. Yet Mr. Trump remains tough on Iran, using maximum pressure as he sees it. And Iran ruled out diplomacy under the current climate. Take a look.
Iran and the U.S. in a war of nerves, waiting who'd blink first.
We have no indication that anything's happened or will happen, but if it does, it will be met, obviously, with great force. We'll have no choice.
Iranian President Hassan Rouhani said he favors talks and diplomacy, but not under current conditions. Iranian state news agency quoted President Rouhani saying today's situation is not suitable for talks and our choice is resistance only. According to Iranian media, Iran has quadrupled its production of enriched uranium after Mr. Trump and Iran's foreign minister traded threats and taunts. Washington's decision to leave the 2015 landmark nuclear deal dismayed other signatories to the deal. Under the accord, Iran agreed to limit its nuclear activities in exchange for the lifting of economic sanctions. Last week, the EU's top diplomats expressed their determination of the EU and its 28 member states on carrying out in full the nuclear deal with Iran. Britain's foreign minister did send a stern warning to Iran.
I would say to the Iranians, do not underestimate the resolve on the US side in this situation. They are not seeking a conflict. They don't want a war with Iran, but if American interests are attacked, they will retaliate, and that is something that the Iranians need to think about very, very carefully.
Though both sides made it clear they didn't want to see war, US military preparation is underway. The United States had deployed ships to the Middle East in a move US officials said was aimed at countering Iranian threats on American forces in the region. Non-essential US diplomatic staff were also ordered to leave Iraq. Tehran has described US moves as psychological warfare and a political game. Other regional powers are worried about the brewing tensions. A senior official in Saudi Arabia said his country will do its best to avoid war in the region, but stands ready to respond with all strength and determination.
For the latest issue about Iran, let's go to our panelist in Washington, D.C., Joe Rubin, president of the Washington Strategy Group, who was also a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. In Brussels, we invited Fraser Cameron, Senior Advisor at the European Policy Center in Brussels. In Beijing studio, Zhou Rong, a Senior Fellow of the Chongyang Institute of Financial Studies from Renmin University of China. Welcome to the three of you.
Thank you.
Mr. Rubin, of course, I go to you first. Who is deciding on the policies toward Iran? Do we see a concerted agenda within the administration or not?
Well, thank you for having me, Tiana. And this is a moment where the United States is finally starting to get its ducks lined up, as we say here. President Trump nominally is in charge, but up until now it has looked as if John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, has really been driving this policy, along with Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State. But now we're hearing the president continually speak out about Iran, so it looks like they're finally getting some internal process underway inside the administration that really gets at the Iran policy. But that said, there's a lot of, frankly, monkey business that can happen behind the scenes to try to maneuver the president into making decisions that he may actually not want to make. And that includes ramping up the pressure and the rhetoric in such a way that accidents and mistakes happen out in the real world, in the Gulf region, between us and the Iranians, that maneuver President Trump potentially into taking actions that he would not necessarily order proactively.
Mr. Cameron, I don't know whether you agree with your American counterpart. First of all, Twitter governance has never been new for President Trump, and this time probably not either. Therefore, why do we need to understand that is President Trump coming into grip of the situation about Iran? Secondly, we do see so many different views coming from particularly Mr. Bolton, who is having his reputation starting from the Iraq war 15 years ago. So what do we know about, from your perspective, European perspective, the U.S. stance on this? Do you trust it?
Well, the Europeans gave Pompeo a rather dusty response when he came to Brussels last week. You know, essentially the Europeans do not trust Bolton or Pompeo. I mean, Bolton has a long track record of advocating military action in Iran, in North Korea and elsewhere. The Europeans simply don't buy into this. They don't believe what the Americans were telling them last week in terms of the intelligence assessments, and the response of the Europeans was, calm down please, let's try and get things back to a normal keel. So there's support for Trump's basic policy of not getting more involved in Middle East wars. That, we hope, is what will actually be the outcome of U.S. policy.
On the other hand, Mr. Zhou, we all understand that the presidential election is already everybody's looking at in Washington. So how much of the so-called Iran policies, like it or not, is designed in a way by the current administration toward a presidential election back at home?
Yes, it seems President Trump is trying its best to please Israel interest group and also try to get more votes from the Jewish people. On the other hand, Trump likes to listen to hawks advices rather than some moderate advices. I think even more think tank gives some suggestion, some rational, some reasonable suggestion that launch a war on Iran may not benefit America anymore. And also we know that American people don't like to have any war with Iran. Even some hawk have such kind of a bad idea.
All right, we'll see what American people think. Well, we don't know the survey yet. Mr. Rubin, you know, you've been working in the State Department. So when it comes to an important policy such as that toward Iran, what is the procedure in which a policy, a consensus can be reached, and that would represent those of an administration? What used to be the way?
Sure, I'll comment on that, but I also do want to mention one thing about, as a Jewish American, I think it's important to point out that Jewish Americans actually in poll after poll oppose military intervention towards Iran, and in fact, much of President Trump's political base is against military action. They're the ones that would fight the war. They'd be on the ground. So there's not a real specific political upside for this, which is what makes this very difficult. And it goes to your other question. I served in the State Department when John Bolton was the Undersecretary of State, in many ways maneuvering and lying about the intelligence that we used to invade Iraq. And what happened there is that the process broke down. We had a narrow set of leaders who were maneuvering the process outside of the normal channels, from the Vice President's office into John Bolton and his office, and pushing people like Colin Powell, for example, to make misstatements and outright lies at the United Nations, and sort of boxing in President Bush, who he supported the invasion, but his options given to him by the process were very limited. Right now, that's the danger here, is that Bolton and Pompeo, as our guest from Europe said, they're seen as identical. If they maneuver the system where there's really very narrow options given to President Trump, it's going to put him in a very dangerous position. I'll close with this. The other thing is President Trump had a chief of staff who was a general. He had a defense secretary who was a general for the first 2 years. He doesn't anymore. They're very civilian, these two individuals now. So he really doesn't have a lot of protection outside of the commander of the Joint Chiefs, who is not a political person.
At the same time, Mr. Cameron, as sophisticated as you are about Washington politics, you have also noticed, I'm sure, that Mr. Trump has been investigated for one thing or another thing. There's even talk of impeachment. Certainly, he's vulnerable politically still in Washington, despite of his personal fight against all of those. So how will those also, in a way, have any impact on how he makes decisions on a daily basis, given the situation in Washington, particularly now, Mr. Kavanaugh?
I think Mr. Rubin's right. I mean, there's no big upswing for Trump in actually contemplating a war with Iran. You know, rhetoric is one thing, but actually committing U.S. forces to inevitably another swamp in the Middle East would, I'm sure, have a big impact on his popularity. I mean, he'll be fighting the election next year on the economic record, and going to war with Iran is going to severely damage the global economy and have an impact on America too. So I think, honestly, it's the last thing on his mind.
And
Mr. Zhou.
And Trump has miscalculated the situation, the risk. Iran is not like 40 years ago. Iran has many, many friends in the Middle East. Look at Lebanon, look at Iraq, look at Syria, even look at Afghanistan. We all know the Shia militant supported by Revolutionary Guard. Look at the Houthi military in Yemen, and look at Hamas. Look at what we say, the Saudi Arabia, the East, and also Bahrain. So that is it is a big danger for America if they launch a war.
And also, what about the other countries? Mr. Zhou, I want to go to you first very briefly. You know, people say, well, China import a lot of oil coming from Iran, and therefore China has a huge interest there. But it's not only China, but also European countries, Japan, and many other economies as well. So, of course, the U.S. now has alternatives when it comes to energy, but scrambling off the overall stable situation over there is in no interest of anyone. Mr. Zhou, what do you make of the divisions and possibility that the economies and countries could come together and come to some kinds of consensus, even to a certain degree, for the immediate future? Mr. Zhou.
Yeah, I think one thing that is China may not just surrender to Americans' maximum pressure. China may continue its oil import from Iran, and also Turkey, Iraq, and also they have their own option. Even we all notice Indian, even South Korea, they will do something. I know the Intex and the SPV cannot fully support Iran, but can relax Iran's difficulties. Iran may survive slightly better rather than without any help.
I see. Mr. Cameron, what about for the European economies? Of course, Iran is a big exporter, but not necessarily the only for the Europeans. What do you make of the consensus among economies and countries for the immediate future?
Essentially, it boils down to whether Europe is going to be more affected by not being able to trade with the United States or Iran. And it's very simple. All big European companies have basically cancelled contracts with Iran. The smaller ones, if they have any dollar exposure, will not be willing to take that risk either. So it's going to be extremely difficult for the European side to maintain their part of the bargain on the nuclear deal in terms of propping up the Iranian economy by increasing trade and investment. That is simply almost impossible now.
And Mr. Rubin, given what the other two speakers have talked about, more than complicated situation now and different realities now in the Middle East comes to Iran's situation with the other countries, and also the JCPOA's differences now in opinion and certainly in stances. Mr. Rubin, are we going to see situation getting ever worse and probably continuously?
Yeah, I think we are, and that's the real shame of this entire situation, is that we had a functioning nuclear deal where it was verified that Iran was not increasing its nuclear capacity and had actually taken out the most threatening materials that we were most concerned about. And so right now that's unraveling, and the United States is beginning to have, as we've just discussed, an economic war with our partners, our allies in Europe, with China, where we have the tariff battle already, and now this just compounds it. And to what end? What's the objective here? The State Department, Mike Pompeo, laid out a dozen objectives that seem almost fantastical, and no negotiating strategy for how to achieve them. And we ripped up a baseline diplomatic agreement. So the concern here is that each side now sees this as a negative versus a negative, and essentially we spiral into a direction where Iran's nuclear program begins to get reactivated, the United States sends warships over, and no off-ramp. And that's what we've been trying to avoid, and that's what the Obama administration helped us to avoid, and unfortunately we're back to where we were many years ago.
Joe Rubin, Fraser Cameron, Joe Rong. Thank you so much for the three of you. We're running out of time. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your insights.